What's good, YouTube? It's me, your boy Squiddy, back in another Squidio. Today, let's talk about the best decks that are actually in the format, because we are actually starting off with a new season of Yu-Gi-Oh! Competitive events. We are getting regionals as of this weekend in all sorts of different cities, as well as a YCS in less than a month. And now that the metagame has sort of ramped up a little bit, we've gotten to see a lot of things out in the open. We had a remote duel extravaganza, we had a couple of local tournaments, we just had a lot of different games on DB. We can kind of get a sense of what decks are good, so I thought I'd make a tier list just to see which decks, in my opinion, are the decks to beat and which decks are where they rank. Starting off at the top, obviously, in the S tier, we have KASHTIRA. This is a no-brainer. I think a lot of people have forgotten about the power of KASHTIRA because there have been so many new support cards and so many new archetypes released. Everyone's kind of gotten bored of KASHTIRA, so they've kind of moved on. So in the online space, like in Dueling Book, in locals, not a lot of KASHTIRA are present because people are just sick of the deck, frankly speaking. It's just not fun. It's linear, it does the same thing. It's not fun for you, it's not fun for your opponent. But the fact of the matter is that this deck still wins. People are going to be playing it at larger scale events like regionals and YCSs. You are going to see this deck across an event like that. Now, is this deck going to be the most popular deck? That's hard to say because people are, again, going to be experimenting. They're just tired of playing KASHTIRA. But if you go to a YCS, a 10-round plus tournament, you will be playing against KASHTIRA, especially in the later rounds, because the deck is so freaking consistent. It gets to play a lot of different cards to adapt in the metagame, so whether that's hand traps or floodgates. And on top of everything, it gets to play D-Shifter with no repercussions whatsoever, and that's a card that basically nerfs every deck in this format at the moment. So when they can just auto-win, have an auto-win button like that, it's safe to say that that deck is probably going to be the best deck. The other deck that we have to talk about beating is actually PURRELY. So this is a no-brainer. Everyone already knows that PURRELY is pretty good. It's really hard to out and X PURRELY Noir right now. It's sort of made a weird shift in the metagame. Like, we have to deal with the Rise Heart, and we also have to be able to deal with X PURRELY Noir. Whether you're playing hand traps, or you're playing cards like XYZ Encore, or cards like Herald of the Abyss, or Kaijus to get rid of it, you have to adapt your side deck in a way that actually prevents the X PURRELY Noir from coming out, and if it does, you have to have now to it, otherwise you are going to lose. So we're kind of in a weird spot right now in the metagame where you have to deal with two things, the X PURRELY Noir and the KASHTIRA A Rise Heart as the biggest, baddest boss monsters in the format, and are very annoying. I will say that PURRELY has kind of made a push towards playing more hand traps because cards like Infinite Impermanence, Mourner, Effect Veiler even are so good against the deck, especially when they don't have the field spell. So that deck's existence definitely means that we have to kind of cater to it by playing some more hand traps. The other tier 1 deck that I actually think is pretty tier 1 is Dragon Link. Now, this deck obviously has an abysmal matchup against KASHTIRA, provided they don't have an out to a Rise Heart, but it's just so easy to out the Rise Heart nowadays when you're side decking things like Hurricara, even Book of Eclipse, Book of Moon, and when they don't have the answer, that means you're probably going to win. Anytime Dragon Link can actually play, I don't think there's any deck in the current format that can actually outgrind a Dragon Link player because the Bystials are so darn degenerate. Bystial Magma just allows them to add a dragon monster every single turn, on your turn as well, because they use the effect of Branded Regained to be able to special summon it back whenever you summon a monster. They're able to draw a card when they banish stuff as well. It's just so degenerate, and on top of everything, they're able to play through so many hand traps. The existence of Hieratic Seal means that they don't care if they get nibbed. We saw this in the World Championship, where Paulie was able to full combo through nib, because Hieratic Seal allows you to summon a dragon from your deck, and combined with the powerful extenders that they have, like Chaos Space, the Baby Dragons, even Seifert, giving access to that line is just so broken. So I think this deck is definitely a deck that we have to beat as well. So I would definitely consider main decking Nibiru this format, because it's good against KASHTIRA, it's good against Dragon Links. It's not so good against PURRELY, but it's good against a diverse metagame where there's a bunch of different decks that also special summon more than 5 times. Alright, moving on, let's talk about the next deck, Branded. This is surprisingly, in my opinion, a B tier deck. Now, don't get me wrong, this deck is absolutely insane when it gets to play, okay? If everything is resolving, this deck probably puts up the most pressurizing end board and the most powerful recursion in the format. However, the fact of the matter is this deck just does not get to play half of the time because of the existence of Ash Blossom and other hand traps like D-Shifter. It just makes it so that this deck has a tough time surviving the metagame. Now, this deck can actually play through Ash Blossom nowadays. If they're going first, they play other cards, other engines like Triple Tactics Thrust to set like a Fusion Duplication or like a Nadir Servant, so they're still able to play. However, they cannot play through Ash plus anything else. Okay, when I was playtesting this deck, I realized even if your opponent has like a Fenrir plus like 2 back rows and an Ash Blossom, it makes it hard for this deck to play through because your Branded Fusion is the main way that you're actually starting your plays, which are actually threatening to your opponent. Anything else like a Nadir Servant or like Triple Tactics Thrust or anything for that matter takes either a turn to set up or is just not enough to break your opponent's board and have enough for the comeback on your opponent's turn to protect yourself from whatever they have. So it's just like kind of a weird spot where Ash Blossom is still powerful enough plus anything else, and the rest of the deck just doesn't function as well without Branded Fusion. So it kind of gives me the impression that it's just not a powerful, consistent deck that I would pick up for a 10+ round event at this moment in time. So that's why I'm relegating it to the B tier list. And I also feel like you won't see a lot of Branded because a lot of players have kind of come to that same conclusion where the deck just struggles a little bit more. Another deck that's Fusion-esque, I say, is Chimera, and the reason why I want to put this deck in A tier is not because I'm a fan favorite and I've been playing in this format, it's more so the fact that you can play a lot of non-engine cards in this deck. The core engine still relies on 1-card starters, and you can also play cards like Fenrir or cards like Branded Fusion to get started to your engine, as well as pseudo-extenders. But the nice thing about the deck is the core engine is so compact that it's still 1-card engine, but you get to play a lot of non-engine. You can play a lot of hand traps, you can play a lot of go second board breakers like Triple Tactics Talent, just a bunch of prevalent cards that allow you to protect yourself and still be able to play. And the other thing is a lot of people are main deck or side decking Anti-Spell Fragments and Dimensional Shifter and Debarrier. So those cards are all absolutely huge hoses against fusion decks. Against Branded, like, it really does them in, especially with Dimensional Barrier. But against Chimera, it's a little bit less volatile because Chimera Fusion is a quick effect. So if we activate Branded Fusion, we can chain Chimera Fusion to still be able to play on top of their Dimensional Barrier. We can still play hand traps to protect us, so their end board is a little less significant, so we can still probably survive a turn through Debarrier. And there are just a lot of ways that the non-engine actually lends a hand to this deck that I think it's a lot more consistent and a lot more powerful than the Branded, in a way that you're trading the power for more consistency and more defensive. So that's why I think this is actually a solid A tier deck. Other decks are talking about Sprite. I still think Sprites are really good. This is encompassing all the different variants, so the Live Twin, the Runick Sprites, the Pure Sprites. I still think they're a solid tier 2 option because the deck is still doing what it does, right? It still spams out a bunch of huge board negates, Sprite Red, Sprite Carrot. It plays through a lot of prevalent hand traps like Nibiru, doesn't really care. And you're able to play a lot of non-engine, so that all compounded together, I think this deck is here to stay until we get a ban list that somehow neuters the Runick stuff and maybe a little bit to the Sprite engine. And that's to say Fogo and his friends FURHIRE also still tier 2, playing the Runick stuff as well. I still think this deck is obviously really, really devastating if they go unchecked. They're a little worse now that people are actually siding Drone Lockbird again, as well as a lot of hand traps to prevent things from resolving. But I still think the deck is still consistent enough. It's still good enough that it's a solid tier 2 option. People have just kind of forgotten about it because they've been busy toying with the new friends that we got in Duelist Nexus. But once YCS start again, I think people will realize that this deck is still good and they're going to go back to playing it. Other decks, Sky Striker. This is a solid tier 3B option. It's obviously been power crept tremendously by whatever the heck Konami decided to print throughout the past year and a half, or the 2 years, or the 3 years even. I feel like this deck has just not been good forever. And even with Engage in 3, potentially the deck might not still be good because it's just like, it's so weak. You have to take a turn to set everything up. Everyone's playing hand traps, everyone's playing Droll, everyone's playing Ash. Engage just doesn't do enough as to what it used to do nowadays. Even setting like a huge board with multi-roll, there's just so many board breakers. People have Evenly, people have Harpy's Feather Duster, Lightning Storms, just easy way to clear the back row and then just push for game. Ray is also not as annoying as she used to be. Now people are playing Bystials, Ghost Bells. There's so many card functionalities that just allow you to circumvent Ray or just not care about them adding back Engage because you're able to put up Omni Negates on the crackback. So it's just not as good as it used to be in 2017. Labyrinth, I would say, is still a solid tier 2 option in the A tier because it's still doing what it does. I think it's a lower tier 2 option because people have figured out how to play against this deck, okay? People are siding Cosmic Cyclones. People are realizing that, hey, I can hold my Cosmic Cyclone in my hand, and then when you go end phase Stovey effect to set a card, I could chain the effect of Cosmic Cyclone, and then banish whatever you're setting in your end phase, and that just goes huge plus value for the player activating Cosmic Cyclone. People are also siding more back row hate. People are realizing that Ghost Spell and Ash and how to use them against this deck, and just recognizing how the deck plays. and stopping a lot of their plays while doing so. So I think it's a lower tier 2 deck, but it's still good enough where the core engine still strikes a good balance in the metagame right now, just playing a lot of traps and floodgates to stop the decks from playing. It's still a solid tier 2 option. I feel like Altergeist is probably B tier status right now because the deck is just a little bit still bottlenecked by the same things that it was traditionally bottlenecked by. For example, having to play a bunch of trap cards, which are just not as good as the trap cards in Labyrinth, which have a lot of synergy with the furnitures and so on and so forth. Whereas the trap cards in Altergeist are more traditional trap cards. You actually have to set them in order to get some value out of them, or you set them off the effects of your Altergeist. But even the link climbing stuff that we got doesn't really contribute to the overall game plan of the deck. It just adds a little bit of combo firepower to the deck, which I think the deck still kind of struggled with. It's sort of like in a weird spot where it's a balance between being almost like a combo-esque mid-range deck as well as a control deck. So kind of just doesn't do enough, in my opinion. Okay, next, let's talk about Tearlaments. I think Tearlaments are a solid A tier deck right now. A lot of people have kind of forgotten about them because they're so bad against a Rise Heart. But against every other deck, this deck actually has a really good matchup because they have a lot of firepower. The existence of the 2 millers as well as the 2 shufflers is absolutely crazy. Anytime they're able to hit like an Agido or a Kelbeck, it probably means they're in a good spot because they're getting intrinsic value from the deck. It doesn't matter what they have in their hand, they're just getting +3s, +4s off of their mills and just being able to put up a bunch of different negates like Rukalos as well as Suliak, and on top of their field spell, Pearl Rhino being able to pop cards like Floodgates means that the deck has an intrinsic way to deal with Floodgates against back rows, against decks like Labyrinth, and just put up a board. So I think this deck is a solid A tier option, and it's actually really good behind the top 3 decks right now. This is definitely something you considered playing around with things like Revolution Synchron as well, just playing around with some of the new combos. I think the deck is definitely here to stay. In that similar vein, I think Mannadium are a solid A tier deck as well because of the sheer fact that they're so combo heavy. Now, this deck doesn't actually die to Droll. It can still play a lot of times and put end boards through Droll, even up to 2 or 3 negates. So it's actually a decently positioned deck in the metagame. I think a lot of people are playing hand traps, unfortunately, so you kind of have to deal with that and assess. It also can sometimes struggle against a Rise Heart because a lot of the plays do involve the graveyard, but they're still getting their effects off of the little baby ball thingies when they do get banished. So that's just one thing to consider. All the Mannadiums do get the effects still, so they're still able to play through a Rise Heart. It just makes it a little harder because they're not going to be able to make things like Astral out or take advantage of their Scareclaw plays. But I think the deck is still here to stay. It still has a lot of degeneracy. People are playing like Calamities effects as well, so locking out your opponent, period. It can be really scary when this deck wins Dyro. I think it's a solid tier 2 option. Infernobles, I would say, are also between A and B. I want to say they're A because of the unknown factor. A lot of people don't know what these cards do, and in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, that's actually a big thing. If you don't know what your opponent's cards do, or you're not really familiar with them, and it's a high stakes event, you kind of have a lot of nerves on the line, there will be people messing up against this deck. And the fact that the deck is a combo heavy deck that does a lot and there's so much to keep track of, I think this deck is a solid A option right now just because of that unknown factor. It's really hard to identify the deck's main choke points now that they have a lot of new cards. Assault isn't necessarily the same choke point that it used to be in this deck. They have a lot of new cards like Angelica and just different ways to play through things, even if they have to face a bunch of hand traps. So I think this deck is a solid A status deck right now, and it's definitely something you guys should read up on. It's definitely a deck that is threatening in the metagame at this moment. Rescue Ace, I want to say, is a solid B tier deck. The issue with this deck is it's currently caught in the crossfire where a lot of people are playing hand traps like Baylor, Mourner, Impermanence, and when they stop your Turbulence, that probably means you're just playing a fair deck, like a worse edition of Math Mech, I want to say, because they just have the same similar link plays, but they're relying on setting 4 with Turbulence. And having to play at least 2 traps in your main deck means that there are 2 bricks that you don't want to draw on this deck. On top of going second can be very hard because you're intrinsically drawing cards that aren't very good going second, aka all of the spells and traps. And then you also don't really have any threatening extra deck monsters. Like, you have to kind of invest your entire extra deck into cards that protect your set 4 or push that play through. And then going second, you don't really have a lot of firepower. You have like Access Code and the typical Cybers plays that have been heavily outdated. You don't really have a lot of things to deal with boards, and the deck can be really fragile sometimes. If your Turbulence gets stopped, you're probably getting OTK next turn, or you're probably bricking on certain cards. I still think it's close to an A tier status where it can definitely top events, but it's just kind of volatile. It's not as strong as it seems on paper, unfortunately, due to consistency issues, power issues, and the fact that it's a little bit volatile in the metagame right now. RIKKA is still a solid A tier deck. I think this is one of the higher A tier decks for sure because of the fact that people still don't really know what they do. Like, there's a lot of text on these cards. There's easy to forget things, and they have a lot of extenders through the RIKKA engine on top of the SUNAVALON engine. There's just so much to keep track of. They can also play certain hand traps to cater to the metagame right now. They're unfortunately still hosed by A-Rise Heart, but as long as they have an answer to A-Rise Heart, which is pretty easy, built into their deck as well as their side deck, that deck is here to stay, and I think that people should read up on them because they are a little bit threatening. Floowandereeze are a solid B tier still, in my opinion, because they are also caught in the crossfire where a lot of people are playing hand traps. A lot of people are siding drolls now, which also hurts the deck. There's just so many things that kind of host this deck, unfortunately, in terms of hand traps and also Cosmic Cyclones, things along those lines, that I don't think this is a very good pick for the metagame. It can still top an event, but it's probably really, really volatile at this current moment in time. Same with EXOSISTERs, I want to say around the B tier. The issue with this deck is that you can't play so many hand traps. You have to play a lot of traps just in the core engine. It does get some bonus points just for the fact that people also don't really know what they do. We saw Steven Santoli get to the Worlds with EXOSISTERs because no one really knew like how to play against them. No one really expected them. And there are a lot of cards that actually interact with the graveyard right now, so it kind of puts EXO a lot higher on that list. But I still think across the 10 or 12 round tournament, it could be a little bit volatile. So you do have to be a little bit careful when you do play decks like this. You have to get a little lucky and hope to open either what you want or have everything swing in your favor in terms of die rolls and just, yeah, being consistent. Dark Worlds are a solid B tier as well. The issue with Dark Corridor is that it doesn't solve any of the problems the deck traditionally has. We're still struggling against things like Drone Lockbird, against Shifter, against A-Rise Heart. So there's no real way to amend that. And Dark Corridor, really all it does is kind of work with the consistency of the deck, which the deck didn't really struggle with. It still bricked at times, but it didn't really brick enough to warrant that hurting the deck's potential. So I think that Dark Order doesn't really boost the deck that much. We have to really have a solution to powerful hand traps and also effects that banish our cards, cards that prevent us from playing essentially in order for Dark World to be impactful. But I still think a Dark World player could definitely get lucky in a run and potentially top a major event. Gold Pride Punk, I want to say it's a higher B tier. It's between A and B. The issue is the deck just still traditionally is a little bit hurt by, I think, hand traps as well. And it kind of struggles a lot with consistency issues. Going second sometimes it can be very hard because you're playing a very fat engine with the Gold Pride cards as well as the Punk cards. So when your opponent is also playing other cards like Drone Lockbird and things that might actually hurt this deck, I think that this deck just falls a lot in terms of tier status. And then Vanquish So I think is a high B tier as well. I want to say that this deck is a lot better now because of a mid-range pushed metagame, and this deck actually has a pretty good matchup against KASHTIRA, I would say. Being able to outgrind them, being able to whittle them down, being able to summon Raisin to kind of control the board that way. I think it has a decent matchup. I think the PURRELY matchup is okay as well because you're also able to play Floodgates like there can be only one, but the deck traditionally struggles against bigger decks that put up big boards like Branded or sometimes even Dragon Link. So going second, it's a little bit of a struggle. You also have to play a little bit more suboptimal hand traps like Ghost Spell and things that just to mesh with the attributes because you have to reveal the certain attributes for your assist effects. So that's just one thing to keep track of when playing that deck. Synchrons, I would say, is also a high B tier. I don't think this deck is good enough to warrant being a high A tier or even S tier. It's too volatile. It's a glass cannon deck. It gets hosed by a lot of hand traps. It's just not consistent. You have to kind of hope to win the die roll. Going second is really hard to break boards because your engine is so freaking huge that there's just no way to play enough non-engine to justify this deck being good. And this deck, I feel like, is outclassed by other combo decks in the format like MANNADIUM or like INFERNOBLE, where it's easier for them to just combo off of 1 or 1.5 cards, whereas this deck traditionally needs at least 2 cards to be able to start off their plays, and there are a lot of choke points, and your engine is just so big. That's just my thoughts on that deck. I actually think Unchained is either a high B tier or a low A tier because number one, not a lot of people read the effects, and number two, the deck has a lot of recursion. The deck has a lot of ways to get stuff back from the graveyard. They're able to play trap cards as well as incorporate aspects of the Labyrinth cards if you choose to. And also on top of that, they're able to take control of powerful cards that we already have, like Tour Guide from the Underworld, to set up their link plays. I think the deck, now that it's fresh, it's a lower A tier, but once people figure out how to side against them and how to beat them, it's probably a B tier because the deck actually doesn't do a lot for what it can do. You just end on like the same kind of end board that's kind of mediocre, easily outed by a couple of cards, and they do rely a little bit on their trap cards in order to stay in the game. And last but not least, I think SWORDSOUL is probably a high B tier because it's just, well, people already know what the cards do. People already know how to beat it. It's just relying on predominantly winning the die roll and setting up something like a Baron plus like a T-Shao, maybe like an anti-spell or a Floodgate, and doing the same thing over and over. It also dies a lot to certain hand traps like Nibiru, getting very, very hosed by that card. So it's just something to watch out for when you're playing that deck. That's all I had for the video. If you guys have any decks that we missed on here, definitely let us know in the comments below. Or if anything that you disagree on, anything that I might not be aware of, guys, definitely let us know in the comments because I would love to hear what you guys think. Other than that, we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.